So in this demo, I thought I'd show you how I bind a quilt. Now, binding a quilt is not the thing that most people really like to do. And some people do it strictly by hand. I don't. Others do something that's they'll use their sewing machine on one side of the quilt and then finish it off by hand sewing it. Or if you're like me and you don't like to hand sew, then I do it all on the machine. Now, the thing is, some people say that it's better if you do it, finish it off by hand because you get your stitches exactly where you want them. I don't worry about that too much. They come close enough for me on the machine, and if I match my bobbin thread and my top thread up with the color that's on the quilt, and in this case I'm using a dark blue thread because my binding, as you can see here, is dark blue, and on the front side it's dark blue as well, then I don't worry about that. No one's going to see the stitching. So when I do machine binding, I start on the back side of the quilt, and I've already made my binding, and I think I have another video up showing you how I make binding. And I just roll it out. Now I have a lot more binding here that I'm going to need, but that's okay. I'd rather have too much because there's nothing worse than getting almost to the end of binding your quilt and you don't have enough binding. Ask me how I know. So I'm going to start about the midway along one side, and I'm going to leave a tail, and I'm going to use my Wonder Clips. Now you could pin it. I like to use Wonder Clips. They're easy and they keep things nice and straight. So I'm putting the raw edge of my binding up against the raw edge of the back of the quilt. And I'm just going to clip all the way down on the quilt. Now I'm not going to go all the way around to all sides of the quilt for this. Pull this up a little bit so it's on my table. I'm only doing this one side right now just to get it started so I can easily put it in underneath the needle on my machine. And I just take it to the end. And pretty much there. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this over to my machine and show you what my next step is. So here's my setup. What I'm using for my foot is I'm using what's called on the Janome M7. It's called an HP foot, which is a high performance foot. But this is the foot I use for piecing. It's a 1/4 inch foot. It gives me a very accurate 1/4 inch, and I want to use that 1/4 inch when I sew the binding onto here as well. So that's all set up, ready to go. So I'll take my quilt and I'm going to stick it under the needle, and I'm going to leave that long tail. And at the left side of my sewing machine, I have a little platform over here that extends my table area and keeps the weight of my quilt from falling onto the floor and pulling things out of alignment. So I just take that clip out. I'm going to line this edge up. I've already got my thread here. Everything is set up for a 1/4 inch. And I start to sew. Now you can see I am not moving at a terribly fast pace because I want to keep everything in alignment. And you know, because this is a full-size quilt, it's heavy and it's going to be pulling against me, and you don't want that because then things are going to get out of alignment, and you're going to have, you know, parts where your binding did not get sewn. So I just take the clips out and I take a look and I put my fingers on it just to make sure that my raw edges are lined up with each other. And as I said, I'm sewing a 1/4 inch. Now you'll see that there's some fraying here, some loose threads. I just push those off to the side. They will eventually get buried in the binding. Some of them I will cut off. So I'm just proceeding down here along the edge of this until I get to my corner. And I'm going to show you what I do at the corner when I get there. Now, some people might be more comfortable using a foot that has an edge guide on it, so you could butt the raw edge of the binding and the quilt right up against the edge guide. But I have found that that isn't as reliable as doing it this way. But if that's what you're more comfortable with, by all means, use it. I did for a very long time. Okay, so I'm getting closer to my corner. So what I'm going to do just before I proceed on is I'm going to take a small ruler and my 1/4 inch line on it and a chalk marker. And I'm coming down to the edge here. Now I hope you can see this in the camera. Okay. What I'm doing is I'm lining up that 1/4 inch mark and I'm going to just draw a light chalk line on the binding. So this is from the very edge of the quilt. And that's where I want to stop my needle. Now there are other ways to do this, but I have found this is the most, for me, gives me the most accurate corner turn. So I'm going to carry on. I'm going to sew up to that line. And a couple more. One more. Okay, right on the line. I'm going to tie it off. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to miter this corner. So I'm going to reposition my quilt, which is easier said than done. And I don't know if you can see this or not. I hope this is in the camera shot. Okay. So I have a stitch right in here, and I'm just going to pull my binding up and make a 45-degree angle fold. And I use my fingers to press that down fairly good. And then I fold this down and over so that this edge is in line with the edge of the quilt. Now sometimes I'll use a stiletto. This helps. If I put the stiletto right underneath and in that edge, I can sort of pull this down a little bit. And you want to keep it even. The first time you do this, it feels a little awkward, but the more times you do it, the better you get at it. Now I'm just going to put my needle down, and I'm still hanging on to this, and I'm going to push my edge, my quilt edge with the binding folded over, right up against my needle, lining it up with the foot so I get a 1/4 inch, and carry on. Now that I have that anchored, this is where what I do is I could take the whole quilt off the machine, go back to my table, and clip the binding all the way down. But I don't really need to do that. What I'd rather do is put a clip in a couple of spots, and that keeps me lined up, and I carry on. When I come to a clip, I take it out, and this keeps everything nice and straight. And so I'm not fighting with the binding and the quilt and everything else at the same time. Now when I come up to that second clip, I'm just going to line the binding up again along the edge. I'm going to put in another clip, take that clip out, and carry on. And this is how I'm going to do the whole back of the quilt to get the binding secured to it. And I'm going to go around each one of those next corners, doing the same thing to make the mitered corner that I just showed you. And then I have to join the binding ends, and I'll show you how that works in a moment. So I thought I'd show you again how I do the corner. So I've stopped my needle a little ways away. I'm putting my little ruler with my 1/4 inch seam allowance line on here, and I'm lining that up with the edge of the quilt, and I'm just going to mark a chalk line right there, and that is my stop line. So I come up to this and try to get my needle right on that line, tie it off, readjust my quilt, get it spun around here. So I'm going down the next side. And quilts are a bit heavy, yes. So, just going to show you up here. I hope you can see this. So again, I'm going to take this and I'm just going to fold my binding at a 45-degree angle right here. I'm going to finger press it, and I'm going to fold it back over on itself, and I'm just going to use my stiletto as my guide. You don't have to use the stiletto. You could do it just by hand, but I find the stiletto helps me get things straight. Get that folded piece of the binding straight with and flush with the edge of the quilt. Drop my needle. Put the binding underneath, 1/4 inch from the edge, right up against the needle, and carry on. You're probably also thinking, wow, look at all the thread frays that he has hanging out from this binding. That's a lot. Yes, it is a lot. And I'll tell you why I have a lot. And before anybody makes a comment on this, I did not cut this parallel with the selvage. I didn't cut it along the grain. I cut it cross grain. Now you're going to say, well, why did I do that? Well, the reason is this binding is actually the leftover pieces that I cut off from the quilt after I took it off the long arm machine. And in that case, I am using 108-inch fabric, and the longer the strips are that I can cut out for the binding, the less I have to join them. And I like to do that. So when I put this into, and I cut my binding using my Quilt, my 2.5-inch strip die. And of course, Quilt tells you to put your selvage, your fabric onto it. Oops, little pull here. What am I doing? Up we go. Keep your needle down. Yep, almost pulled that offline. What AccuQuilt tells you to do is to line up your selvage along the long edge of the die so that it's, you're facing it, and that way you'll be cutting your strips along the grain. I didn't do that. And I already explained why. I want as long as strips as I could get out of this. So I have a lot of fraying happening. But you will see when I come to the next stage how I tackle that. And basically what I do is, for most of the fraying, I will bury it into the quilt. Now you get some pieces on here that I see that I'll just cut off because they're in my way. But I mean, I could be here all day cutting off these frayed threads and it's still fray, wouldn't it? Yeah. So we don't worry about that. And again, I know there'll be some of you out there go, oh my God, you can't do that because then you're going to have frayed threads which will peek out from under your binding. No, I don't. And I'll show you why when I come to the next stage where I flip the quilt over and I get the binding all in place for the finishing round. Now I'm coming up to where I want to stop sewing the binding. You don't want to sew the binding all the way down. Remember, we left that tail at the beginning? Well, we need to leave a tail at the end as well so that we can easily do a biased join on this when we're finished. So I marked the end, or where I want to stop, with this clip that's coming up. So I'm just going to sew up to that clip. And I'm going to tie off my thread at this point. So now I have a fairly long tail here, which I don't need this much because I made more than enough binding for this, but I'm going to leave it as it is for now. I'm going to take it over to my table and I'm going to show you how you join up the ends of your binding. Okay, so now I want to join up the ends of my binding on the quilt, and I left a very long tail, as you can see, on this end, and then I have a tail on this end. So we'll come back to those in a second, but here's how much binding I had left over. I made more than enough binding. I don't throw this away. I roll it up, I put it in a bag with other scraps of binding, and if I need a piece of binding for something that's a little smaller, say a table runner or something like that, I just reach in my bag and I grab some of this and I've got ready-made binding. And because I saved them all, I've got them in various colors. So we'll toss that off to the side, and then we're going to take a look at how we do this. So the equipment you need for this, you will need a pin. And you see here I have a gap between these two tails. I'm just going to eyeball the center of that gap, and I'm going to stick the pin in there in the center. So it's approximately equal distant from either edge of these pieces of binding, or these binding tails. So I'm going to take one of these tails, and I'm just going to lay it across against the edge of the quilt, just like that. I can see my needle, my pin is popping up right here. And I'm going to take a ruler, and I'm going to find 1 1/4 inches on my ruler, and I am going to mark. Now what I like to do is actually put the pin at the 1 1/4 mark this way, so I have a flat edge down here, and it just so happens on this little ruler I'm using, it's almost the same width as the binding, but whatever method works for you. But the whole point here is that you are divide the width of your binding, the original strip, which was 2.5 inches, divided by 2, that gives you 1 1/4 inches, and that's where you're going to mark for the tail at this side away from it. And I just use my chalk marker and I draw a line. Now I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to cut this. So I want you to be sure that you understand what I'm doing. Here's my pin, here's my tail coming from this side. I've gone 1 1/4 inches to the left of the pin that I put in here. I've drawn a line, and now I'm going to cut on that line. Okay, another piece of scrap binding. Put that tail out of your way and take your other tail, and you're going to do the same thing, except you're going to mark your 1 1/4 inches to the right of that pin. So I've lined it up on my 1 1/4 inch mark, draw my chalk line, and snip. So it's very important that you snip beyond the pin. Otherwise, you're going to have a hole in your binding. Ask me how I know. And that's a bitch to fix. So take out your pin. Now here's the very awkward spot. So you want to have some of your clips or pins ready. So on the tail that's to your left, and make sure your tails are at the top of the quilt, not towards you, because you'll get all screwed up if you do that. I know. I fought with learning how to do binding simply because I had watched a video, but I had flipped the quilt the wrong way. So you want this, or what I want anyways when I do it. Everybody has their own method, okay? This is how I do it. I want it at the top. I'm going to take this piece of binding, this tail, and I'm going to open it up so that right side is up, as so. Okay, make sure it's the right side and don't get it twisted. Okay, then I'm going to take this tail, lay it out, and I'm going to open it up, but I'm going to make sure that when I open it up, without getting it twisted, I have the wrong side facing up, just like this. Now this is where it gets really awkward, because what I want to do is I want to take this piece and lay it on top of this piece so right sides are together, just like I was making the binding originally. But because now I've got a quilt attached to it, this makes it very difficult. So you can't really have too long of tails, and I'm afraid that I may have made the tail's a little short, so it's going to make this a little bit more awkward. So you kind of have to crunch your quilt up and get these two pieces right sides together, one over the top. I hope you can see that. So one over the top of the other. I take some clips and I just clip those there, keeping the edges straight. Then I take my ruler and a marking tool. I'm just going to use a pencil. It'll show up the best here. And go from corner to corner. Now I need to find where that other corner is. There it is right there. What I like to do is I find the corner and I just leave my tip of my pencil next to that, slide the ruler up against it and then up to the other point, and then draw a line. Okay, so that's where I'm going to sew. I'm going to sew along that line I just drew, used proper English, just drew, and then I'm going to clip. I'm just going to use a pair of scissors and I'm going to cut 1/4 of an inch away from that sewn line to get rid of that corner, and then just open up the quilt and the binding will lay exactly where I want it, and I'll finish it. I'll show you what I mean. Okay, I'm back at the sewing machine, and you are going to struggle with this. And this is probably the most annoying part of this whole process, is getting this lined up so that your tails are laying flat and in the right position. That's the reason for pinning it or for clipping it. I'm going to put my needle down and I'm going to sew along that diagonal line. Okay, my sewing machine came unthreaded, which figures, doesn't it? So let me rethread my sewing machine here. This happens. This is real, people. Definitely not staged. So we'll get this rethreaded. Okay, we're rethreaded. Should be ready to go. I'm just going to start back at the beginning. You want to keep it nice and flat and stay on that line that you have drawn. Your clips may get in the way, just take them off. And when you've come to the end of that, let's cut my thread. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my scissors, and this is just a time saver. I could get up, I could go over to my cutting mat, and I could just take this and, you know, use my rotary cutter, make it nice and straight, but it doesn't need to be that straight. I just need about 1/4 of an inch eyeballed from that sewn line. Get rid of that. And now here's where the magic happens. If all goes well, I should be able to open up the quilt, and I did, and I think you probably saw that. And now my binding is laying flat. I'm just readjusting my quilt. I'm going to put this under my needle. I'm going to start back a little bit from where I stopped sewing. Line it all up and continue doing exactly what I did before. I'm just carrying on with that 1/4 inch seam allowance with the raw edges of the binding together. Now this is why you have to be very careful that you don't get things twisted when you're putting the tails together, because if you do, well, you're going to have to tear it out. It's the only way you can get around it. Ask me how I know that too. So what I'm doing now is I'm just going to come along and finish this binding up, making sure everything's lined up. So I'm sewing up the hole, basically. And then I'm going to take it back to my cutting table. I'm going to lay it out, and I'm going to flip the quilt over, and I'm going to show you how I prepare the quilt or the binding for finishing on the other side. So I'll come back and show you that in just a moment. Okay, so now what we want to do is bring our binding from the back of the quilt to the front. And this is where hand sewing might come in handy. Actually, if you were to hand sew this, you would do it in the opposite way. You would sew your binding onto the front, pull it around to the back, and then hand sew it down. But I'm not doing that. So with machine binding, this is where I go. So you see what I've just done. Let me show you that again. I've pulled the binding up. I'm not going to worry about this corner at the moment. I'll show you how to handle corners in a bit. And I'm just pulling the binding up so that it lays, I can feel with my fingers that it's laying up against the edge of the quilt. And I put in a clip. And then I just work my way down. Now, remember those frayed pieces, those threads? I'm tucking those underneath. Now, some will peek out on the back. Like there's one here, you probably can't see it. But after I clip it, I'm just going to take my little scissors and just give it a little tug and cut it off. So yeah, maybe it's an extra step. If I cut my binding with the grain, I would have less of those to worry about. But like I said, I have my reasons for doing it this way. And they may not be to your liking, but that's okay. There is no hard and fast rule about doing binding or how you get it done. For example, what I'm doing right now, that every 3 or 4 inches I'm clipping. This is a bit of a slow process, but binding is a slow process. For example, just doing attaching the binding to the back of the quilt, that whole process took me about 40 minutes to do. Now, yes, I stopped a couple of times to show you something on the video, but nevertheless, it is not a fast process. So don't be in a rush. Give yourself lots of time to do this. So if you're trying to bind a quilt at 2 o'clock in the morning because you're going to a shower the next day and you want to give this quilt as a gift or something like that, don't do that to yourself, because you will get frustrated, you will screw up. And you know, the other thing too about binding is what makes you feel good is you can see the end of the quilt, because although you may have enjoyed the process of making the quilt, we all get tired of them and we want to move on to the next project. So again, we just want to get it done, and that's why we'll probably rush at doing the binding, but don't rush. I mean, after all, it's the binding that really finishes off your quilt. You know, it's amazing how a quilt and the quilting in your quilt looks so much better when there's a binding. So don't screw up. Okay, I got to pull my quilt up. These things are my little homemade 3D printed fabric weights. Because my table is not hugely long, I just put those on, keeps my quilt from sliding off the edge, because the quilt's quite heavy at this point. And we're going to continue down, clipping, tucking fibers, or the threads, the frayed threads, underneath the binding. And if I get some of these frayed threads that are really quite long, I will clip them before I pull the binding over. And I'm also trying to keep my binding straight, same width along the edges. And if some of these are hard to get in, lick your finger. Oh, I know people are going to go, "What? You lick your finger?" Yeah, I do. Whatever works. And there's a stray one peeking out. So we'll just get rid of that. And carry on. Now sometimes, depending on how you squared up your quilt, and did I mention that? I've already squared up this quilt, which you should do before you put binding on it. Otherwise your binding's going to go wonky. But you want to know something? No matter how careful we are, things don't always come out absolutely square. So you can compensate for that, as long as it's not much out. like I'm not talking here out by a foot, I'm talking out by, say, less than a quarter of an inch, then you can just, adjust your binding as you're pulling it around to compensate for that. You're trying to keep it as straight as possible. You don't want it to be wonky. And I'm getting closer to the corner now. And have lots of clips. Lots and lots of clips. Could you pin this? Yes, you could. But I like Wonder clips. I use them a lot. And because I'm prone to stabbing myself with anything sharp. Pins, needles, the whole bit. So I don't want to get blood on my quilt. So that's why I use Wonder clips. Now I'm going to adjust the quilt. I'm going to bring it up so you can see this corner, because I'm at a corner, and how I do that. So just let me bring this whole little bugger up. It is heavy. You are manipulating a lot of fabric here. Okay, that's not good. It's going to block the view. Okay. I'm going to see if I can move. Sorry for the shaking. I'm just going to see if I can move this in just a little closer so you can see the corner. Okay. So here's my corner. Now, I do need my handy dandy stiletto, because I find the stiletto really helps with this process. I'm going to put a couple of weights on here to keep it from sliding on me. And all you're going to do is you're going to miter the corner. So you pull the corner down. I hope you can see that. And I'm just finger pressing it. And then I'm going to pull it over. Now, I want to make that point that's on the edge here. And I know this is very difficult to show, but you just fold it over, sort of like a gift, like a package. And so that bottom corner of that miter is right on the edge of the binding that's going that way. I hope that made sense. And then when I have it adjusted that way and no puckers in it, I'm going to take a clip and I'm going to clip that corner. And I'm just going to start the whole process over again and clipping. And if I need to, I can adjust this, because I don't want any bumps and bulges, but I do want that corner lined up with the edge as close as I can get it. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take the whole quilt, rotate it around, and I'm going to continue clipping. And when I come to a corner, I'm going to do that mitered. And so I'm going to have this whole quilt is all going to be clipped. Yes, it takes a little bit of time, but it's going to make your job, when you get it back to the sewing machine, you're stitching this down so much easier. And I'll show you that in a moment. Okay, we're on the home stretch. Now we're going to sew on the front of our quilt the binding. We have it all clipped, and yes, you're going to need a lot of clips for this. And again, you could use pins, whatever you're comfortable with. I like the clips. Now, I've changed my foot. I've gone to my AccuFeed walking foot, which is an exclusive product to Janome, but you could just use a walking foot or whatever works for you. You don't necessarily need to use even a walking foot. You could just use your regular foot, but I find that engaging this foot with its AccuFeed system, it pulls from the top and the bottom of the binding of the quilt and pulls it through very nice and easy and less strain on your body. And believe me, there's a lot of strain on your body when you're doing this. Now, the foot that I've attached here has an edge guide in the center. It's called a stitch in the ditch foot. And what I do is I line that edge foot up right with the edge of my binding. And then I adjust my needle so that it goes just a little bit to the right of that edge foot. So I've got about 1/8 of an inch where I'm starting to sew. Now I'm looking here and I think I want to adjust my needle just a little bit more. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Okay, so I'm ready to go with this. Again, this is not something you can do fast. Do it slow and steady, and take your clips out as you come to them. So I'm going to put my needle down, and away I go. Now I'm keeping that edge of that binding right up against the edge guide without letting it curl up. And this will help me to keep my stitching as straight as possible. And because I'm using, as I said, dark blue thread to match both the binding, the backing, and this border on top, you won't be able to see my stitching. So for those of you that are purists and who like to do it by hand, the reason you do it by hand is so you can hide your stitching on the front of your quilt and it all looks very nice on the back. But because I'm matching up the thread, I don't worry about that. Yes, if you examine it real close, you will be able to see my stitches. And they won't be perfect, but you know, it works and that doesn't bother me. But if it bothers you, well, you might want to look at other methods, especially hand binding of a quilt. So I'm just going to carry on as I'm doing right now, and I'll show you what happens when you get to a corner, because you have to do a bit of a pivot. So I'll show you that when I get there. Okay, now I'm coming up to a corner. So what I do is I continue sewing until I just get up to that, and this is where you're going to want your stiletto to keep your hand safe. So I just come here a little bit, make sure that that corner goes under my edge guide. Okay, now I take the clip off, use my stiletto to hold that corner in place, and now I'm just going to stitch just beyond the edge of where that corner is. And that looks like I've got it pretty much lined up. And now I leave my needle down, raise my foot, and I'm going to pivot the quilt. And yep, I got it right on. So my edge guide is right where it should be against the edge of my binding. And I'm just going to take a few stitches here to get it going. And I'm just going to carry on as I was doing before. Going down, using the edge guide on this stitch in the ditch foot, and work my way to the next corner and do the same thing at each of the corners. So I will show you the finished result. So here's the finished quilt. It's all bound now and all finished, and I think it turned out pretty nice. But I have a few tips for you in this whole process. And again, remember, I am just telling you what I do. It does not mean it's the absolute right way. Well, there is no absolute right way. So some things. First of all, wonder clips are your best friend. You cannot have too many of these. You cannot have too many pins. I like the wonder clips over the pins simply because I draw blood when I use pins, as I've already mentioned. So the wonder clips are great, and don't be afraid to use a lot of them. A stiletto. If you don't have one, get one. They are so good for so many different applications when you're sewing. It keeps your fingers away from your needle, for one thing, which is very, very important because nobody wants to sew through their finger. But also you saw on those corner points that I was mitering, it's really handy for holding those down until you get a stitch or two into that spot. Some other things. You have to realize that a quilt is heavy. Yes, it's just fabric and thread, but that all adds up, and that's going to put a strain on your body. So if you can build something or set up a folding table or something that is pretty much level with your sewing table that you have, so that you have an extended area, you can put your bulk of your quilt on that, and that will help it from pulling down and putting extra strain on your shoulders, on your arms, and on your hands. But even more so than just the strain, it will help you to keep your quilt straight and flat as it goes under the needle. And if it's tugging and it's pulling, it will create a warp in your binding. So you want to be careful with that. So the combination of the extended table and the wonder clips or pins will really help you to stay away from a warped binding. What else can I tell you that may be helpful? You can never leave too much binding free when it comes to putting the two pieces of binding together on your quilt. You have to manhandle that quilt to get those pieces of binding to overlap each other. And if you cut the pieces too short, you will be struggling. So yeah, leave more than enough, more than you think you need, and that will help out as well. What else can I tell you that I have learned over the time that I've been binding quilts? Oh yeah, take your time. Take your time. This is not a quick process. What you saw today, if it had been in real time, took me about 2 hours to bind this quilt. And you may want to take frequent breaks while you're doing it because it can get very tedious. And again, as I said, it can cause some problems with your shoulders and your arms because you're lugging a lot of fabric under that needle. So be gentle to yourself with that. Take breaks as you need them. Don't leave any of this to the last minute. Don't stay up at 2 o'clock in the morning trying to bind a quilt because you need to give it as a gift the next day. Plan ahead for this because I can definitely say that if you rush this procedure, you're going to have problems. Okay, so I hope you learned something from this today. And as I said before, there are many ways to do it. This is how I do it, and it works for me. So thanks for watching, and stay tuned for future tutorials.